tax the rich. Evidently, the so-called Tax Freedom Day was May 9th this year. The anti-tax forces take note of this day as the day after which the average American has earned the amount of their tax obligation for 1997, and from thereforth earns the equivalent of their after-tax income. Some outfit called the Tax Foundation noted that this year the day is 4 days later than it was in 1994, when the Republican-dominated Congress promised to lower taxes, and it's 2 months later than it was in 1940. This same group notes as evidence of the increasing tax burden that people in the top 1% income bracket pay 30% of the taxes. For some unknown reason, these statistics are taken as evidence of an increasingly unfair tax burden on wealth. I found this very odd. The tax burden on the wealthy is indeed unfair, but it's unfair to the rest of us. The wealthy continue to make out like bandits. According to Holly Sklar, as of 1996, the wealthiest 1% of the population controls as much wealth as the bottom 95% of the American population. This means that in a country of 250 million people, the richest 2.5 million people are as rich as the poorest 237.5 million of the rest of us. On average, rich people are 100 times wealthier than the average person. Does this strike you as fair? In terms of income tax, this means that the super-rich 1% of the population ought to be paying more than 90% of the income tax. According to these anti-tax people, the top 1%, the very wealthy, pay a whole 30% of the tax, which means that these very wealthy people are avoiding a full 2/3 of their tax obligation. The reason, then, that Tax Freedom Day comes so late in the year, May 9th in this case, is because the average taxpayer is being held responsible for double their fair share of the tax obligation. The problem with taxes in this country is not simply that they're unfair to ordinary people, the average taxpayer. The problem is that rich people are cheating us to support their greed. We're told that services to working and poor people, environmental protections, civil rights prosecutions, are all too expensive, and yet the very wealthy are paying only 1/3 of their fair share of income taxes. There's something insidious about the way in which the Tax Foundation presents its information. And one right-wing nut in Congress has decided that the so-called Tax Freedom Day should be set by law as April 15th. That would be a Republican from New Hampshire. I'm sure you're not surprised. John Cuniff of the AP has noted that because of the pseudo-progressive nature of the income tax system, with economic growth, Freedom Day will necessarily come later and later year by year, because people will generally move into higher tax brackets over time. Of course, he doesn't bother noting that if the tax burden was fairly distributed and taxes for working people were cut to their fair level, that Tax Freedom Day would actually come earlier and earlier each year, this because the greed of the very wealthy causes them to amass increasing wealth. So, while income as an absolute may be rising, its distribution is more and more unjust. Further, I'm sure it escapes Cuniff's attention that real wages for working people have been declining for the last 20 years. And, what with the current assault on working people by the very, very greedy global imperialist class, the real possibility of working people's wages even keeping up with inflation is a joke. The actual likelihood is that working people will pay less tax over time because their corporate bosses are keeping more and more of the wealth working people generate through our labor. Which means that taxes are likely to continue being outpaced by the cost of providing services, let alone the cost of providing the obscene military-industrial complex, which, you might guess, will result in lower levels of government service, less environmental protection, less civil rights protection, more misery, sickness, injury, and death for us. Using the measure of the average taxpayer is simply absurd, because it tells us nothing of how taxes are levied and collected. It tells us nothing about tax equity. Sure, the taxes working people pay are excessive, but the answer is not eliminating capital gains taxes or lowering taxes on corporate profits. The answer is fair taxation on wealth. Make the rich pay their fair share. This is Richard Curtis.